In our story today, the disciples and Jesus have been working hard, sharing the good news, caring for the sick and the hungry and the homeless and the needy, basically living the Jesus life, which we all try to do, don't we? And they're ready for a coffee break, maybe a nap, at the very least, some quiet space. Maybe there were some introverts among them. And they can practically see that Starbucks drive-thru ahead of them, and they're imagining how nice it will feel to lay down and rest for a while after their grande low-fat caramel macchiato with extra whipped cream. And suddenly all of their hopes and dreams are derailed when they see that between them and that Starbucks is an enormous crowd of people, and it's growing bigger by the moment. And before they can rest, there is more work to be done. Oh, bother, they must have thought. They had probably reached their limits, and still more was being demanded of them. Have you ever had one of those moments when you find yourself stretched to your absolute limits, when you feel you have nothing more to give? Jesus and the disciples have been doing the work of ministry for a while, and there is so much need around them. They've gone from one situation to another with barely room to breathe in between. They haven't had time to rest or to eat or to even just be. And then comes the horrible news that John the Baptist has been beheaded by Herod at the request of his wife Herodias. Now, we didn't hear that in today's gospel reading because John doesn't share this story, but the synoptic gospels do. The disciples are weary, and now they are disheartened and grieving. Surely they must wonder if anything they are doing is making a difference, or if all of them will end up with their heads on a platter like Jesus' cousin John. People are desperate to be near Jesus. They're desperate to be near his disciples. They've begun to hear the stories of all the miracles he has done, and they long to be changed by Jesus themselves. And yet, even though he is weary and is in need of rest, without a hesitation or an under his breath groan, what does Jesus do? He sees the people in need, he has compassion, and he wants to care for them. And almost immediately after he sees the large crowd gathering around him, he says to the disciples, "Where are we going to get the food to feed these people?" I don't know about you, but Jesus sounds an awfully lot like us, wanting to feed people. After all, what do we do when we gather together? We eat. You can almost see Jesus dreaming of casseroles. And the disciples respond with nothing but bad news. There isn't enough money, and there isn't enough food. But then something really important happened. A little boy was there, and he let it be known that he had brought some food with him, some bread and some fish. Probably just enough for himself or maybe one other person. I don't know if he tentatively raised his hand and volunteered to share, or if the disciples saw him munching on some of his meal and he offered to share. But it became general knowledge very quickly that there was at least some food in the crowd. But let's not get our hopes up. The Greek word used here for fish, opsarion, is indicative of a small thing, a small amount of fish, or literally a small fish. And likely, the fish would have been no larger than a sardine, because small sardine-like fish swarmed in the Sea of Galilee. In those days, fresh fish was a luxury, for there was no way of keeping it fresh for very long, but you could always pickle it. So it was likely pickled sardines that the little boy had with him. And there were only 2 of them, hardly enough to feed even one growing boy. And the bread that he had was less than desirable. Barley bread had a negative connotation to it because only the very poor and the very desperate would lower themselves to eating this yucky bread. The fact that it was barley loaves tells us that the little boy was from an impoverished family. But then again, any crowd of Galileans would have been overwhelmingly composed of people like them. Jesus takes this young boy's loaves of yucky bread and 2 tiny pickled fish, and he gives thanks for them and breaks them into pieces and then starts to pass them around. And something amazing happened. Everyone was fed. How in the world did that happen? Pastor and economist Stan Duncan envisions what might really have happened that day. He writes, "It's very likely that what happened was something like this. Jesus took the little boy, he set him in front of the crowd and said, 'Hey, all of you, listen up, look up here, focus. Okay, now I know that all of you are very poor, and all of you are afraid that you don't have enough even to survive on your own, and you are afraid to spend anything. I'm going to put this little kid out here in front with his, frankly, pretty dismal offering for all of you to look at. He's saying he is offering to give us everything he's got, and I want you to see that. And then I'm going to break up his yucky bread and give thanks to God for it, and then start distributing it to all of you, and then you will, well, I don't know. Let's see what happens after that. All right? Got it? Don't let me down. So now bow your heads. I'm going to pray." And he starts praying. And then I think as the bits and pieces of food are handed down the aisle, one person starts to think to himself, you know, the wife did make me this sandwich and packed me this thermos of coffee, and I probably don't need all of it. So I'll break it in half and pass it down with the barley as it comes handed down the aisle to me. And then the next guy says, well, I do have this banana that I forgot to check at the gate when I came in, and I don't need all of it, so he breaks it in half and passes it down. And then there's the guy who picked up the box of Oreos at the 7-Eleven that morning on the way out of town to the rally, and the one who won the turkey at the meat raffle at the local meeting last night, and the one who remembers he still has a piece of that fruit cake left over from the office party a couple years ago that never went bad, and so on, all down the line, until all the loaves and fishes had been passed around, and the disciples gathered up the scraps and found 12 baskets full of leftovers and snacks. I like that possibility because it's real. There have been a handful of times when I was mentally preparing what I was going to make for dinner, when suddenly a member of my family said to me, is it okay if so-and-so comes to dinner? Or if someone is already at our house, is it okay if they stay for dinner? Now, I want to be a gracious and competent hostess like my mom always was, but my gut reaction is almost always, ah! I panic. Why does it have to be tonight? On this night, the night I was planning on making ramen noodles and chocolate cake for dinner. Couldn't you have given me some warning? So I can understand Philip's response when he says to Jesus, 6 months' wages would not be enough for each person in this crowd to get a little. In other words, there isn't enough. Of all Christ's miracles, the stories of the resurrection and the feeding of the 5,000 are the only ones that get this much attention. They are the only ones recounted in all 4 Gospels. This is very important for us to realize. Here is a story that every single gospel writer felt we needed to hear. Why? Because this story is central to our understanding of who Jesus is, and therefore is also central to who you and I are called to be as we seek to follow him. Jesus is telling us to come to him in our want, in our lack, and that in return he will give us his abundance. Bring our meager scraps of faith, and he will turn them into a feast. Bring our donations of clothing to McPhee Elementary School or the City Mission. Bring our financial gifts to the church, and so on. It will never feel like it's enough to make a significant difference. But when we all bring our little bit, a lot happens. A miracle happens, because where we see scraps, God creates abundance. Jesus is telling us that if we will only come to his feast, we will never walk away hungry. He is also showing us that in order for miracles to occur, we have to do our part. We have a role to play, because faith is not a passive thing. The word faith may be a noun, but it really needs to be a verb. We shouldn't focus on having faith. Rather, we need to be mindful that we are doing faith. There's a lot of need in this world. I still feel an awful lot like Philip. Sometimes I feel a little hopeless, as though nothing I can offer will ever be enough, and that even what I have to give won't start to satiate the stark needs of people in this world. And then there's the problem of my self-perceived scarcity. I, like you, might be aware of what I lack rather than what I already have. We can have a bit of an obsession with the idea that if we give our things away, there won't be enough left for ourselves, so we hold on to them tightly. Is it possible that a boy's meager lunch was, by Jesus' holy touch, able to serve thousands without anyone in the crowd distributing their share? Of course it is. Jesus could have done that in a heartbeat. And maybe that's what happened. But perhaps an even greater miracle would be getting people to share their own meager offerings, just like that little boy, so that all might be fed. Maybe that's the miracle in this story. We all have needs. God knows we have needs. He saw that thousands were hungry and he fed them. He knows what our unmet needs are too, and I believe he works in unexpected and unseen ways to meet our needs. But what are we supposed to think about all who continue to hunger in the world today? Because it would be foolish to try to ignore the obvious. People are still starving. People are still struggling. Doesn't Jesus care about them? Of course he does. But the disciples had to do the work of gathering the food. People had to reach into their pockets and pull out the chunks of stale bread and salty fish and the lint-covered fruitcake and give them up for Jesus to use. So I think if people continue to hunger, it's not on God, it's on us, because we're not sharing what we have. We look to God and say, "Where are you, Lord?" But I think God is looking back at us saying, "Where are you?" In Jesus' worldview, we who have power, which is all of us here today, are to act towards those less powerful as Jesus did to the people of that day. We're to have compassion, we are to care, we are to be shepherds of them. And this is both a gift and a burden. It's hard to be shepherds of people around us. But today I want to invite you to be the boy in this story. Be a part of the miracle of generous living. Share your food. Offer it up to Jesus so that God can work a miracle and others might be blessed. And let's not just offer up our food. Let's offer up everything else that we have. Our time, our energy, our financial resources, our gifts and graces that God has given us, even our weaknesses, because God can bring something beautiful out of those too. One of the most convicting things Jesus said was when he said in Matthew 25, "Then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.'" We do not have it all. We do not have all the time we would like. We do not have all the resources we would like. We do not have all the rest and quiet space that we would like. And yet the wonderfully joyous message of this passage is that God can do a great deal with our not enoughs. Even our little bits can have an effect in God's kingdom when God is the sufficiency behind our insufficiencies. Think that you're not enough? Well, in truth, maybe you're not, and neither am I in the world's eyes. But in God's eyes and through God's grace, we become enough. Our insufficiencies do not limit God's power. Our inadequacies do not hinder God's will. Our lack of perfection does not get in the way of God using us to make a difference. So we need to offer up whatever we have and say, "Lord, please use even me to make a difference for your kingdom today." And God will never turn us away. Through God, even our lack becomes abundance. There is enough. In Jesus' presence, there is always more than enough. Thanks be to God that we are invited into the opportunity to love one another through our generosity. Thanks be to God for using us for his good. Thanks be to God. Amen.